Hello, everyone. Welcome to our weekly webinar. My name is Madina. I'm a therapist at NoCD, and this is Karen.
Hello, I'm also a therapist at NoCD.
And we are so excited to talk to you guys, answer some questions, and kind of just geek out on some OCD stuff.
Awesome.
Should we just hop right in?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Okay. So I'm going to click this.
Okay.
Is it true that people always do not act on their thoughts, their OCD thoughts, images, and urges? Do you want to start with that one, Karen?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think if you think about thoughts and behaviors as distinct things, of course, one is not always going to lead to the other, and vice versa. So, sometimes, when it comes to just random thoughts like, oh, I'm thirsty, right? Like the likelihood of acting on that thought is, probably high, right? But as opposed to OCD thoughts, which are more intrusive and unwanted, the action will feel a lot more unwanted, right? Because the thought itself is not wanted. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, and I always think of it as such a big difference between a lot of times my members will ask me, Medina, what's the difference between a thought that's OCD and something that you don't necessarily want to do and something that you actually want to do? And the big discrepancy is there's that action piece. We're actually following through. So there's such a big difference between a fear that you will do something versus actually wanting to do something.
Right.
Cool. All right, let's try this one. Is it possible to completely get rid of OCD? Have you seen cases where it's happened? So OCD is chronic. It is something that a person has lifelong, but I'm sure you see this too, Karen, that, with ERP, OCD can definitely be very well managed. So I have seen people's OCD symptoms greatly reduce.
Right.
I don't know what your experience is.
Definitely to the point where I've had a lot of members say, there's days where I forget I have OCD, where I can't remember the last time I had an intrusive thought or had urges to do compulsions. And even if they do have intrusive thoughts, it feels like the way that I'm sure it would feel for people without OCD, where you notice them and then you just keep moving on. And so I liken it to kind of like chronic health issues. Like if somebody has high cholesterol or diabetes, it's not that every day is consumed by that. It's just something that they have to be aware of and be proactive about. But it doesn't have to, it's not like a death sentence in any sort of way.
Yeah. And like something that is really important for me personally to ask my members at the intake is, what is your goal for therapy? Because so often you will hear people say, I want to get rid of these thoughts. And I think it's such a great learning lesson that, as therapists, we're really teaching you guys that the goal is not that we get rid of the thoughts, but it's that we're learning to live with and manage, like you were saying, even though we're having thoughts that we don't like having.
Right.
Cool. Anything else on that one, or should I move to the next one?
I mean, I think a lot of times people also can feel discouraged when they hear the word chronic, and they can be really demoralized, and then they start kind of obsessing over, what if I have OCD for the rest of my life? Why will OCD come back if it is chronic? And so just to be aware of OCD's many manifestations and how even though OCD can look different, from moment to moment, year to year, right, decade to decade, the way that you address it remains the same. And, if as long as you continue to take that bring it on attitude towards your intrusive thoughts, towards anxiety and distress, recovery can be lifelong also, right? So I think that's also a really helpful thing just to remind yourself of.
Yeah, I'm smiling because it brings up something that I see so commonly in treatment when people are starting to get better is that sort of thought where, what if OCD comes back, or, what if it worsens? And it's almost this, waiting for the other shoe to drop is the common phrase I'll hear.
Right.
And that's an ERP in itself, right? We have to sit with the uncertainty of what the future holds, whether you have OCD or not, right? The human experience is kind of like waxing and waning.
Totally. Right.
So yeah, really cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So many questions. Okay. Do you want to pick one, Karen? You can see them, right?
Yeah. We could talk about the pandas.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so have we heard of pandas? Right. So a lot of people who work with the pediatric people with pediatric OCD, there's a lot of kind of occurrences of people who, suddenly develop OCD. I personally, I don't want to speak too much on it just because I don't know that much about it in terms of like a lot of the details of it. But it is, a lot of times when you ask people with who suddenly develop OCD, it seemingly overnight. Sometimes there is that the occurrence of like an infection prior to. And so, obviously, if you go to somebody who specializes specifically in pediatric OCD, they might be able to tell you a little bit more on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just for reference, like typically OCD develops in a more gradual way. So it's usually a gradual onset, and pandas might be more of a, like Karen was saying, overnight symptoms.
Right. And obviously consult with your pediatricians and
yeah,
that as well.
I really like this question. I'm going to click on it. Yeah, this was it. So tips on how to balance recognizing and addressing actual relationship issues versus recognizing ROCD in action, which I can definitely understand why that can be a trickier fine line to kind of walk. And so one of my favorite ways to kind of frame relationship issues is we have to go based off the same data that everyone in relationships goes off of, right? I trust that you and I have both chosen each other, and that we trust each other, even though there's a layer of uncertainty in any relationship. So I think that can be a really kind of distinguishing factor as far as kind of understanding the difference. I don't know if you have anything to add to it, Karen.
Yeah, I think, and this is something that could be helpful, with other themes as well. But often with OCD, there's a sense of urgency and needing to figure it out. Some people might have, uncertainty over, I don't actually know if we'll be married forever, right? Or I don't know, maybe my, the one that got away, maybe he is actually the one for me. But either way, I'm okay with the decision I'm making, right? As opposed to maybe somebody who has ROCD, that urgency to figure it out takes precedence over everything else. And so there's an urgency to getting rid of uncertainty that might be present in for people with ROCD as opposed to actual relationship issues.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, it sounds very basic, but if there is actually issues in the relationship, right, versus what kind of those what if questions, right? What if I'm not attracted to him or her, or I find someone else more attractive, or lots of kind of like rumination, like you said, the figuring out piece.
Yeah, true. Yeah, very much so. Okay. Lots of questions. Good ones.
Oh boy. Okay. I'll pick this one if it's okay.
Great.
Is it normal to feel extreme anxiety when starting ERP, as in things get a lot worse before they get better? I personally do like to tell my members, like, hey, you might feel worse before you feel better because we're asking you to do these really hard things. And we're also saying, by the way, don't do the things that have been really helpful for you. So it's not uncommon, I would say, to sometimes, feel worse before feeling better.
Right. I like to compare it a lot to exercising and like getting in shape, and how oftentimes when you start working out, if you're not in shape, it's going to feel awful the first few times you go to the gym, and just because you're doing something that feels incredibly unnatural. But then the more you practice that those behavior changes and the mindset of accepting anxiety and going towards it, the easier it could feel. It's like the paradox of ERP for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know like we've studied our specific protocol at NoCD, and we find that the members that are practicing the most in the first 2 weeks are the ones that are typically having the best outcome results. And we also found that the first 2 weeks is the most tempting to not practice, which can tell a lot as far as like avoidance, right? Because like Karen was saying, it's easier to avoid something that's really difficult. So, and I always like to remember in situations like this, regardless if you choose to do ERP or not, you're going to be left with discomfort, right? Because obviously, like I'll joke with my members in a way that, you're here, you're sitting with me for a reason. Like life is not feeling comfortable. And so we have to choose which direction we're going to take.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Are you seeing any you want to?
How about the one, if you scroll up a little bit, user 098?
Oh gosh, numbers.
Yeah, it's from 804. So if you scroll.
Yeah. Oh, am I controlling your scrolling too?
I can't choose the question.
Oh, sorry.
you have to choose it for me. Yeah.
Existential question.
The one right above that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. This one.
There we go. Yep. All right. So I'm 16, and lately I've been dealing with disgust over not feeling guilty or anxious over my past mistakes from the ages of 14 to 15. Is this normal for real event OCD? Yeah. I mean, I would say one of the things, the hallmarks of real event OCD is feeling first of all, feeling guilty and anxious. And then once you start to accept that the past is the past, feeling like really like that backdoor spike of, why am I not anxious about this? Why am I not guilty? What does that mean about me? I must be a really terrible person. And so, that's really common for a lot of themes, especially when it feels really like immoral to not be anxious. And I always like to remind people, like, OCD is never going to say it's okay to move on. It's never going to say that it's okay to practice accepting life as life occurs. And so, rather than waiting for it to feel okay, practicing accepting that, the past is the past and you're a human being, right? Just like everybody else. And so obviously easier said than done, but that's definitely normal to, I think some people call it the backdoor spike, if I'm getting my vocabulary correct. But it's super, super common across OCD themes for sure.
Yeah, and I think of it in, what we call the inhibitory learning model, right? We're creating a different relationship with our emotions. And so when we're learning ERP, we're not only learning to accept our thoughts, we're also learning to accept those emotions that don't feel so great, right? So like that disgust and guilt. We're learning to accept that that's part of what it means to be human. Like I've said before, is we have to feel those things. And I think once we bring a layer of acceptance to some of these emotions, they tend to feel less intense, not always. But, there's acceptance around it. So, yeah. And, you said something that made me remember about kind of just like how OCD is never satisfied, right? So, as soon as you finally stop worrying, which is why people come to treatment, of course, OCD doubts that, right? Oh my God, like, what does it mean that you're not worrying about it? Doesn't, like, I had a member the other day tell me, Madina, does it mean that it's not important to me anymore? And we kind of giggled together because I said, what's something you like? And she said, I think like knitting or something. I'm like, do you think about knitting all day long? And she giggled. She was like, no. And I'm like, so then how do you know you like it or you value it or it's important to you? And she's like, I just know. And so I think it's just a good, again, example of how no matter what happens, OCD is never going to say it's okay.
Right. Yeah, it's never satisfied. So it's like a game that you can't win, and so OCD wants you to play this game, not to make it a human being, but to anthropomorphize it a little bit for the sake of metaphor, right? It's never going to tell you it's okay. but it's going to keep wanting you to play. And so the work is really in choosing not to play.
Mm-hmm.
So
Definitely.
right.
What about this one? Oops.
Whichever one.
Okay. Any specific exposures for somatic OCD? So anyone who doesn't know what somatic OCD is, it's can often be kind of a hypervigilance of physical sensations and kind of a misinterpretation as to what those sensations mean. So a lot of times you might see people fearful that they'll have a panic attack in the absence of actually having panic attacks, or just over awareness of physical sensations. And so what we would do in these moments would be what we call interoceptive exposures. So exposures where we're essentially re-evoking physical sensations that don't feel very good. So I don't know about you, Karen, but some of my favorites are like having members hold their breath, and I've done it with them before, and gosh, it's hard to hold your breath for 30 minutes, not 30 minutes, 30 seconds. But you're learning to sit with that uncomfortable sensation, and the premise behind it is we're teaching ourselves not to try to get rid of it or to misinterpret what it means.
Right. Yeah, basically, I mean, it's hard to give you specific exposures, but if you think about like the whole idea of exposure is you want to do whatever it takes to get yourself into contact with the intrusive feelings, the intrusive thoughts. And so if your somatic OCD is really centered around like, what if I can't stop? What if I have a panic attack, or what if I can't stop breathing or thinking about my breathing? You want to do whatever it takes to think about your breathing, right? Essentially, the leaning into the intrusive, leaning into the anxiety in that sense. Yeah. Let's see.
Do you like seeing any that?
We could do the starting therapy tomorrow at 8:05. Gabriel? Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So I start my therapy tomorrow. Last time I tried ERP, I couldn't handle it. Any tips on successfully doing ERP? I think it's great that you're trying it again. And I know like this is like such hard work, and it takes so much courage and compassion for yourself as well. And so I think, sometimes people go in too hard, right? And because they just want to get rid of anxiety. And so they might end up inadvertently flooding themselves and feeling really discouraged. On the other hand, sometimes people never go far enough. And so really just being aware of that and like talking, collaborating with your therapist, I think is super, super important. Like one of my favorite videos on OCD is from Reed Wilson, and he says, don't just comply with your therapist, collaborate, right? This is it's for you, right? And so really talking to your therapist about your reservations, if you have if you're having concerns about doing certain things, like really just make it an open line of communication with your therapist and see, there might be something underneath that in terms of maybe there's another way you could approach the exposure, or maybe there's like a underlying feared consequence that you have to target, So I think, that my biggest tip is to just kind of communicate and be open to the process. Yeah.
It's a good tip. If I had to suggest something, I might challenge you to rephrase kind of the verbiage you used in the question, right? I couldn't handle it. And this is not meant to be patronizing in any way, but more so in a challenging way, as ERP therapists do. But you can handle it. It's really difficult. Like, we can totally validate that. But going in with a mindset that you're not going to be able to handle it is you're not trusting yourself. And such a big part of what I try to teach my members is that you guys can do it. You can, handle this stuff, and you can trust yourself. The amount of trust I see my members give me over themselves is kind of astounding, because I don't know half of these things any more than you guys do. So I think trusting yourself would be my biggest tip.
Right. Definitely like that whole idea of whenever I hear I can't, I always think to myself, okay, like what you're expressing to me is that you're experiencing really strong emotions right now. And that feels like I can't, right? And so just even changing it to I feel like I can't do this. Okay, like just like any other feeling, feelings are not commands. They're not, they don't have to dictate anything, right? And so, I feel like going to bed, right? Sometimes in the middle of the day because I'm sleepy, right? Obviously, that is not the equivalent of, OCD, but, sometimes feelings, I couldn't handle it, right? Like sometimes that was also, maybe there has to be some sort of shaping or more kind of stepwise approaches, or even just like kind of taking smaller steps, but still you're taking steps towards, right, rather than away. It doesn't always have to be leaps, but as long as like you are taking that approach attitude rather than avoid, I think that's going to be key. Yeah. Yeah.
This one is a good one. Reassurance seeking. So what is the best way to stop seeking reassurance? So just like a little background psychoeducation, because I think there's a lot of misconceptions on reassurance. With anxiety disorder specifically, reassurance is so unhelpful. The research actually shows the more you reassure someone, the more unsure they feel about that particular topic or question. And so I know for me, one of the first things I do with my members is I check in if anyone in the family or loved ones are reassuring my member, to make sure that we kind of cut that off from the get-go. And it makes a lot of sense, right? So if I joke with my members, if I came to session every time we met and I asked you, am I a therapist? And they kind of giggle because that kind of makes a lot of sense, right? If I had to keep asking my members if I was truly a therapist, I would then start to doubt it. Again, a small example in the context of OCD. But now that I gave a little background to you, want to talk about what are some best ways to stop seeking it?
Right. Yeah. So I think like talking to the people that you do seek reassurance from, like if you tend to ask a family member or a friend, like to give you reassurance, to let them know, or even like rope them into your therapist with your therapist, so that they can get some education on the best ways that they can respond to you when you do seek for reassurance. And then, almost because sometimes loved ones don't know that they can say no, or they don't know what to say. And so they think that they're being helpful, right? And obviously, like kind of phrasing it as like the best way you can help me is to not give me reassurance. I learned this from a podcast with, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but it was on health anxiety with Dr. Josh Spittelnick. I want to say that's his name. But he this was in the context of health anxiety, but I thought it was genius. And he said for a lot of people who research symptoms or who call their doctor's offices trying to get reassurance, he directs them to do something different, right? So if somebody has urges to call their doctor's office for reassurance, to just call them and say, I think you guys are doing a great job. Right. Or, oops, sorry, wrong number. Right. You can always kind of stop it, even if you had already started. And then if they find themselves Googling, like have a list of random things to Google in the place of researching, which is kind of another form of seeking reassurance in an inadvertent way. But yeah, kind of like responding. If you have urges to seek reassurance from loved ones, have a list of conversation starters, so that, ask them about how their day is going, right? Kind of replace it with a more values-based behavior. I think that's a helpful way to stop the behavior and without feeling like completely alienated and alone.
Yeah, and I think it's important that you bring up like directing your behaviors in a values-based way, because you'll see that if you ask a member, how do people respond when you keep asking the same question, and loved ones can feel a little bit maybe frustrated or irritated, and the person with OCD feels that, right? And then they incidentally then feel guilt over asking those kinds of questions. And so I think choosing from a value space, but also kind of just understanding behind the reassurance, really, you're just asking someone to be a nice person and tell you that you're going to be okay,
Right.
even when they literally have no idea technically.
Right.
And you'll notice too, when you ask for the reassurance, it's that instant like relief, but then maybe 5 minutes later, you're questioning it again.
Right.
So maybe just recognizing too that, it's a very short-lived sort of relief.
Right.
Cool. Oh boy. I think I just scrolled to the bottom by accident. Okay, here we go. What about this one?
How much of OCD is inherited? You know what? I will openly admit I do not know. I mean, I don't think that they actually, last time I checked, I think they're still trying to figure out how much of it is like genetic or, is it the environment, a combination of both.
Yeah, we can't like break it down percentage wise per se, but like most disorders, it's some genetic and some environmental.
Yeah.
So I will say I notice people, a lot of my members will have close relatives with OCD-like behavior, which makes sense, right? You're
Right.
growing up in an environment where you're taught that the world is a scary place. And so if you're seeing that, you're learning that.
Right.
So,
Yeah, nature and nurture.
right. Um,
Let's see. I don't know. I can't pick them, but you
I
could
know
pick.
there's so many good ones.
Um,
Well, let me know if you want me to click
what
on
about
one.
what about 808? What to do with reducing and stopping compulsions? Is that
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
All right. So what to do if reducing and stopping compulsions does not make fear, depression, guilt, and shame go away? I almost stop my compulsions, but still can barely function, and I never feel okay. Well, okay, so there's a lot to, obviously I don't know what your situation is, in more than what you've shared with us. But in terms of like what I try to like the list that I try to run through when my members are struggling, and in the past with past members and clients, I try to really do a good evaluation of, if there's any sort of mental compulsions going on. Like, even it doesn't have to feel like a compulsion, but even just like solving and like wishing, like, oh, I wish I could just feel better. I wish I could feel better. And the reason why is because that just reinforces the idea that the thoughts and distress in general is something that needs to be rid of, rather than just a part of life. And so it's almost like if you continuously treat something like it's scary, your brain's always going to be on high alert looking for that thing. And so then the other thing is maybe sometimes people struggle to make progress if they don't do exposures. So obviously, like, reducing rituals is key, but sometimes there is that idea of almost like overcorrecting and really approaching approaching anxiety through exposures for the sole purpose of changing your relationship with anxiety. So I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think very similar to what you touched on. You want to make sure you're doing exposures and response prevention, right? So it's not enough just to expose or not enough to just do the response prevention. So making sure you're not avoiding anything. I think that's a big thing that a lot of people with OCD will wind up doing. And yeah, kind of how Karen touched on, like, I think the big two words that stand out to me here is go away, right? I think that's the first issue. We can't make depression and guilt and shame go away. We can learn to live with moments that feel depressed or shameful. And so again, we're creating that different relationship. Is that your cat? We're creating that different relationship with these emotions.
Right. Yeah. And obviously, like, if you can, work with somebody who can support you, I definitely always recommend that. Also, if you're feeling really depressed, right, there's kind of like ERP for depression, essentially what I call, like, that's what I call behavior activation. And so, like,
Yes.
trying to augment the good things in your life, even if even if you wake up and you're feeling afraid, or even if you wake up and you feel guilty. Um,
Mhm.
See what you can do throughout your day to kind of come into contact with positive emotions and
Mhm.
things that are important to you.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder that it's not the thought and the feeling itself that's causing most people the issue. It's that response, right? And even if you were to apply it to the depression, like you were talking about, it's, even though I feel depressed, I'm making the choice or the decision not to lay in bed all day and get up and go for a walk or whatever it may be,
Yeah.
even though that activity
Or
may not
whatever.
feel as good,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So
Exactly.
cool.
Mhm.
Um,
Hope that helped. Yeah.
yeah.
Um, sorry, allergies. Everything just bloomed in the past week in my area, and it's pretty.
Yeah,
My sinuses and my allergies are there's not loving it.
I know,
Um,
I can't blame you. If it's any in North Carolina, just a month or so ago, I could see like my balcony was covered in yellow pollen. And
Ugh,
I was like, oh gosh.
yeah,
So
yeah.
hopefully it's
It's
not
the
as bad
trade-off, I
there.
guess. It's beautiful now with all the leaves and everything. Okay. Do you want to do?
Um,
Hmm,
you could do this one.
I can't see which one you're
Oh,
pointing
okay.
to, but you just pick, and I'll be
How
fine.
many times am I going to say that before you
Welcome to
realize?
uncertainty.
What is a healthy way to deal
Mhm.
with severe ruminations? So rumination is a really important compulsion. I think that a lot of times can go under the radar. So the best way I describe rumination is trying to figure something out, and oftentimes can also be a person assigning meaning or worth to a thought. And so, one of the best ways that I help my members deal with this is to have them sit with some sort of statement that provokes uncertainty for them. So,
Mhm.
for example, if I was fearful that, this cup that I touched was contaminated, I could touch the cup, which would be the exposure, and I would sit with a statement like, there's a chance this cup is contaminated. Now,
Mhm.
what that does is it kind of is hard to ruminate when you're thinking that thought over and over and over again. And it's causing you to sit with a chance that this could be contaminated, but at the same time, not trying to figure out if the cup is contaminated.
Right. Yeah. And I think, like, when it comes to severe rumination, um, I guess what kind of constant rumination and, spending hours and hours and hours trying to figure it out or come to some sort of end goal. Um, I often will ask my members, what is your fear about not trying to figure it out, right? Like, how are they justifying rumination? Um, right,
Mm-hmm.
for some people, it's, if I don't ruminate on it, if I don't think about this, it means that I don't care, right? Kind of like what we talked about earlier. And if I don't care, then I'm a bad person, and I don't want to be a bad person, or I have to think about it because that's my only way of like paying for um, these mistakes that I've made or having terrible thoughts, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
or they're trying to figure out something that other people couldn't figure out, right? And so they're kind of like, it's almost like, oh, it's just right around the corner. If I just think hard enough about it,
Yeah.
maybe I'll get it. And so oftentimes just like figuring out like what's your reason for rumination, and really like almost doing like a response prevention script whenever you have urges to ruminate. For example, um, for the like I once had somebody who had existential OCD and would spend like hours trying to figure out like what is reality, what does it mean if this is not reality, all that kind of stuff. And his script, I forget exactly, this was a while ago, but it had something to do with like, since the beginning of time, human beings have tried to figure out this very question, and nobody has really figured out one solid answer. And so, neither have I. And I can sit with the comfort of knowing I'm not the only one trying to figure it out, and use this mental energy to do things that are actually important to me. Um, So, basically, if you're not ruminating, you could do basically anything else with your time, right?
Mhm.
You don't have to solve it. You don't have to do anything instead of ruminating. It's more just like walking away from a math problem.
Mhm.
Walking away from a problem that you don't that
Yeah.
you're trying to figure out. Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I love that analogy. I can't remember where I heard this, but it's like seeing 34 times 12, right? Recognizing that problem there, but not actually calculating what 34 times 12 actually is.
Yes, love
Um,
that. Yeah.
yeah, and I think the other big thing that I notice is, it's this fear that I'm not going to be able to manage the situation, so I have to be prepared, right? I hear that all the
Right.
time.
Yes, the other one. Yeah.
And how many times have we gotten to a situation and it wasn't even one of the 500 things that we thought were going to happen and that we planned for, right? And so,
Yeah.
like you said, kind of
Absolutely.
exploring those misconceptions or positive misconceptions about rumination.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's especially true for generalized anxiety
Hmm.
disorders, feeling
Yeah,
prepared, feeling like in control.
yeah,
A couple people have asked about psychosis, schizophrenia, and OCD. So, um, yeah,
yeah.
schizophrenia.
It was up here, I think.
It's the one right
Um,
above.
okay. Are you seeing it? Where did it go? I know it.
It's right above the one that we just answered.
Oh.
Yeah. There it is. Okay. So, fear of schizophrenia, how to overcome it, personalizations, realization, feelings of myself, how to accept that I'm not going mad. Well, I mean, I think, if you think about somebody else had asked about this, we didn't get around to it, but the whole idea of OCD, like content, um, sometimes I think it can be helpful when people get really bogged down in the content of like, oh, it would be awful to, develop psychosis and not feel in touch with reality. Of course, like nobody's
Mhm.
arguing it's not, but again, right, OCD is all about, you know, demanding that you answer questions that there's no way you can answer that
Mhm.
question, right?
Mhm.
Um, and so, I think when it comes to fear of losing your mind, fear of losing control of your mind, recognizing that that's another form of OCD. And so it's going to take work to accept it, but giving yourself opportunities to practice feeling like slightly out of control, like feeling comfortable with having that question come to mind and not answering it, by doing ERP towards that obsession, I think that can be helpful.
Mhm.
Yeah, I don't know if
Yeah,
any.
and
Yeah,
is there an echo?
no.
No? Um, I feel like oh no. It's like I was hearing my own voice back. I was like, that was traumatizing. So with it, with this particularly, I would, really work on some of the physical sensations. So typically when someone's fearful that they're going crazy, right, they're going to be hyper aware of like, oh my God, did I just hear something? Did I really hear that? You know, sensations, analyzing those, making sure that you're accepting that those sensations are, we live in noisy bodies. So again, not assigning meaning to
Right,
the
right.
physical
Yeah,
sensations.
and I think, like, if you think about ERP in general, right, kind of like how if when it comes to OCD, it's helpful to zoom out. It's helpful to zoom out with ERP too, and think
Mhm.
about ERP as, basically we are approaching, right, going towards the things that give us distress, right? Whether that distress is anxiety, sadness, just overall feeling of just overwhelmed and distress, disgust, all that kind of not just right.
Mhm.
And we're not doing anything to get rid of it. We're practicing
Yeah.
accepting them without trying to analyze or judge them or get rid of them. Um, and so a lot of times for this particular fear, losing my mind, right? Um, your mind has assigned a dangerous meaning to that possibility, and then anything that happens in your day-to-day life that can confirm that fear, your mind is like,
Yeah.
what is that? Right. And
Mhm.
so rather than assigning a dangerous meaning to it, saying, okay, maybe I did hear something that wasn't actually there. Maybe like I'm seeing things funny, or maybe I am, you know, becoming less and less like myself, or maybe I am not fully 100% in the moment right now.
Mhm.
I don't really know. I'm not going to analyze that, right?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and I mean, what you're saying is essentially how OCD is almost never satisfied. So I'm going to guess whether you hear something or don't hear something, OCD is going to be like, but what if, right? So if you hear something, it's like, oh, see, that's a sign I'm going crazy, right? And if you don't hear something, for example, right? Oh my God, what if I just wasn't paying attention? Or what if I still am going crazy, even though I don't think I'm hearing something? Um, and so my one of my favorite things to say, and you can apply this to almost any fear, is the best way to figure out if you have schizophrenia or if you are going crazy is not to think about it. It's to live your life and see what happens.
right.
So
Yeah. A couple people asked about Harm OCD.
oh,
Oh yeah, we
oops.
can do this one
I
first.
accidentally clicked on that one.
That's okay. I haven't been treated for so long now that I can't tell what the difference is anymore from an obsession or reality. You want to take this one?
Yeah, so I guess the big difference I would talk about in terms of an obsession, it's something that a person can't stop thinking about, and they kind of have to identify it as intrusive or unwanted. And that's the big difference between someone who has OCD and someone who doesn't. So someone who doesn't have OCD isn't really going to experience their intrusive thoughts as super distressing or unwanted. Um, as far as it being an obsession versus reality, I would kind of take it back to what we were talking about earlier as far as action being associated with it. So I don't know if your question is kind of like touching on how do I know it's just a thought versus how do I know if I actually want to do it or it's true. And so, for example, if I had a fear that I was going to, I use this example all the time, jump off my balcony. I say it a million times a day to prove this thought action fusion, right? Shockingly, I haven't actually jumped off my balcony in spite of saying it. And we're talking about this in terms of harm OCD. If anyone doesn't know, it's a fear of harming themselves.
Or
And
others.
so, what?
Or others.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And so the actual obsession could be, oh, what if I jump off versus me actually wanting to jump off. So I could obsess about it all day long, but there's a difference between that and me actually wanting to engage in that.
And
I
I
hope
think
that
there's
makes
also
sense.
that fear of because sometimes people, I guess, if you're on like the more severe end of OCD, it could feel like, no, I truly do think that I might want to,
Mm,
but it's like, does that thought feel like does that thought feel scary to you? Does the thought of that becoming true, does that feel disturbing to you? I think that is another good kind of distinguishing factor. Um, so
that's a good point. Because a lot of times, too, like people will be often checking how they feel, right? Does this make me distressed? And again, another depiction of how OCD is never satisfied. So
yeah.
obviously, people don't like feeling anxious per se. But then as soon as they
Mhm,
stop feeling anxious, what does that mean? Does that mean I actually do now want to do that thing
mhm.
because I'm
Yeah,
not worrying about it?
totally. Um, okay, so let's see. Um, oh yeah, I mean, I guess like we were sort of talking about it, but a few people asked about Harm OCD and how to do ERP for that. And
Oh, okay.
kind of like what we've been saying is, um, when it comes to Harm OCD, obviously it's sort of like the most unlike traditional
Mhm.
therapy, when you're doing Harm OCD exposures. But it's the same way that we would do ERP for any other type of OCD, right? To do things that bring on those thoughts, to bring on that doubt of like, what if I do something? What if I want to do something? And then the response prevention is to purposely do the opposite, or practice resisting, doing whatever you usually would do to gain any sort of certainty or reassurance.
Mhm.
Um, and so, depending on the Harm OCD, there's like, in vivo exposures, like things that you would do in real life. There could be imaginal exposures. So again, right, it's kind of definitely something that if you are seeing a therapist, to collaborate with them about and really work with them on building a hierarchy, and kind of zoom take the lens and zoom out a little bit. ERP is ERP and OCD is OCD.
Mhm,
Obviously, there's nuances, right? Themes impact people in very real ways, but
mhm,
the ERPs, you would apply the same kind of formula, same approach, towards
mhm,
harm.
mhm.
Yeah. Um, and I think
Yeah.
also like another added thing, that I find helpful, especially for people with harm OCD and that sense of responsibility or that sense of moral, morality,
Mm,
is, really incorporating a lot of, kind of self-compassion to counteract that sense of shame that a lot
mm,
of people with harm OCD feel, especially, like pedophilic OCD,
mm,
where they feel
mhm,
really responsible, for not harming people and feel really,
mhm,
ashamed for their thoughts, is to really practice like a good dose of self-compassion for like how difficult it is to experience
mhm,
kind
mhm,
of like your worst nightmare in your minds. It's brutal. So, really connecting with others who have similar themes, similar experiences, and knowing that you're not alone,
mhm,
in what you're going through.
mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. I know, specifically with some POCD that, it winds up being this punishment almost,
Yeah.
as if you have been like convicted of the crime. I've seen members kind of engage in that way, and a lot of it goes back to aligning with your values and doing life as if, not as if, living your life even though, you have the fear that you could have or will do or may have done this act. So I think that's a really good
Mhm.
point.
Right. And then, yeah, speaking of values, sorry, we're talking so much, but I get really
I love
speaking
it.
of values, for a lot of people with harm OCD, they care a lot about, their loved ones, right? OCD
Yeah.
kind of latches onto the things that we find important because we value them and we don't
Yes.
want anything to happen to them, right? It's sort of like if you knew you had a winning lottery ticket at home, you would feel really worried about that lottery ticket being stolen, right?
Mhm.
If you had really something very precious, you would worry about something bad happening to that.
Mm,
And so, of course, OCD is cruel, right? And our brains know that we value things, and it kind of comes up with very strange ways of making sure that nothing bad happens to them. And so, thinking about like, okay, if I really value my children, for example, I really value my loved ones, what is a better way for me to show that rather
mm,
than obsessing and compulsing over this, right? What else
mhm,
can I do, right? If I really value being a good parent or a good teacher, what can I do instead, right?
mm,
What would actually be a good way for me to live towards that value?
mm,
Because I know rituals aren't it. So it
mhm,
feels like they are, but they're not. So
mhm,
uh,
mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just more comment this, I guess we could talk about this one for forever, but yeah, obsessions can be a good indicator of a person's like values, their assessment, um, an assessment of their values, if I can talk right now.
Right.
And I like to point out that it oftentimes winds up being a self-fulfilling prophecy. So think of
Yeah.
like harm is, maybe I'm so scared that I am going, I'll just keep my example of jumping off the balcony, that maybe I never go out on my balcony, I never enjoy the sun, and maybe, I really like going to the mountains, but I never go there with my friends because I'm scared of, something that could happen. And in a way, I'm not really living my life, even though that is my fear of dying, right? That I'm not going to be here to live my life. And, OCD is really sly and kind of creating that self-fulfilling prophecy of
Yeah.
that very thing that you're scared of.
So true. Yeah. All right.
Um,
Mm, repetitive thoughts. I'm thinking I can help.
where do you see that one? The
For
very
you.
last one?
Yeah.
This one? Oh wait, you can't see that music. All of
Right.
yours are gonna be like, how many times is she gonna say that?
Right.
Um, Okay.
841. It's kind of all the way at the bottom.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
All right. Repetitive thoughts and thinking that I can help adjust my situation by repeating my thoughts are so exhaustive. Like my thoughts and mental rituals actually help. The over and over is what I have. So I mean, I guess my understanding is that there's a lot of kind of like thought action fusion, like some almost, I don't know, magical thinking perhaps.
Mhm.
Like if I think something, I can help. I will adjust the situation. Um, yeah, I mean, it's exhausting to feel so responsible, right? Like to feel like that burden on your shoulders. So I don't know
Mhm.
if you wanted to
Yeah,
answer
and
this or
kind of like we were talking about earlier is kind of this responsibility, right? I can help or adjust, or if I don't do this rumination or I don't try to figure it out and something bad does happen, I have that burden on my shoulder. And I think recognizing that whether you ruminate on something or not doesn't then, like you mentioned, thought action fusion turn into reality. And we're not assigning what it means about us as people.
Mhm.
We can't control what happens to us. And logically, we know that. And, this is really important to remember with OCD, we're working on behavior changes, not logic, using logic to get someone out of their fear, because
Uh-huh.
logically, most of you know that maybe rumination isn't helpful. But then you engage in it for an hour or two or three or four. And OCD really feeds off that. It's like, well, if it's really not that important, why did so and so ruminate on it for 4 hours? Why did they do that behavior? So I think, recognizing when you behave, OCD is so closely paying attention. And so I don't know if that's helpful or answers the
Right.
question,
I
but
mean, I think
hopefully.
when it comes to like magical thinking and the responsibility, I think you
Yeah.
can obviously there's some like lower level exposures about kind of wishing like bad things on people that you love or
Hmm.
like trying to control things like um like I hope that my window cracks open right now, right? Like over and over and over again, just as like a practice and seeing like, okay, well, that didn't actually happen. I
Hmm.
wonder if I can apply that same approach towards things that are actually scary.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, a lot of like thought action fusion. And so like the kind of the antidote to that is to do things that you wouldn't actually want to come true and seeing actually like what actually happens. Like, are your thoughts actually responsible for that? Um,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
so,
and even like accepting the uncertainty, right, in that, because the rule doesn't apply to every situation. So whatever you're worrying about that you feel like you can help, I'm going to guess you recognize very clearly in other situations, you have no control over it. And so I would encourage you to see that you can understand that logic, right? But OCD is convincing you that it doesn't apply in this situation. And so
right,
I always like to say, until it applies in every situation, we have to make sure that we're not just exclusively applying it to the one fear.
right, yeah.
So,
So this person sent this in a couple times. So
okay.
yeah, so pretty sure. Uh, it says, "Hi, I constantly check on my partner because I'm jealous, even though I know there's no reason. Is this ROCD, and how do I stop it?" Um, I mean, it's hard for us to kind of tell exactly what's going on, but kind of like what we had said earlier, with like relationship issues versus ROCD, there is sort of like a sense of um, like people with relationship OCD, there's a sense of like I don't know why I'm so jealous. I don't know why I
Mhm.
have this doubt. I don't know why this uncertainty feels so large in my mind. Um, as opposed to maybe relationship issues where maybe they're not very trustworthy and like it's a totally logical thing and like anybody else would say, yeah, that makes sense. Um, but then there's also that sense of urgency, like I need to know right now that he's never gonna or they're never gonna hurt me, right? Which obviously that could be true for people without ROCD too. But I think
Mhm.
it's asking yourself like, do I actually believe this, or is this something more that I just have doubt over all the time, and I don't know why I'm doubting this. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you have anything else to add about that.
Not too much. Again, just the verbiage right here. How do I stop it?
Yeah.
The jealousy, to a certain degree, we've all felt, if you're in a relationship, we've all felt, a twinge of jealousy, and you can accept or manage that feeling, right, without having to do anything. So you can allow yourself to feel jealous at moments, but then choose not to check, right, whatever the checking behavior is. So, and I always say, like, is that the goal, that you never feel jealous? Is the goal that you always find your partner attractive? Is the goal that you guys never argue? And typically the answers to those questions is no. So technically we're already at our goal. But OCD is convincing you of this unrealistic, unattainable goal.
Right, totally. For Mario,
Yeah.
54. Yeah, so it's hard. I'm not sure if you searched the IOCDF website, International OCD Foundation. I don't know if you can find anybody there, or I'm not actually sure about like international therapy services. I know, like, we're in England and the UK, they're the same, England and Australia, but in terms of other providers, you could. I know, like, sometimes people are able to provide internationally, but I'm not exactly sure who. But I wanted to show this just in case anybody had any pointers, or if other providers end up seeing this. But I can certainly ask around, and I can put whatever responses I can find, maybe in like the YouTube comments or something, because it's rough when to deal with this on your own. So.
Right. Yeah, and even in the meantime, using as many resources as you can. There's definitely a lot out there. Obviously our YouTube channel, Instagram has a lot. I know the OCD Stories podcast can be really helpful just in the interim.
The app. And I'm not exactly, I'm not actually sure about the support groups, if you have to be like where if there's
I don't think you do, because I ran one, I think, with someone.
International? I mean, I would imagine.
Yeah, because they're free.
Yeah.
So.
So that might be an option in the meantime as well. But we certainly, I would love to be able to do some legwork and try to find somebody, do my best to try to help you with that. So.
Yeah. And just for the community support groups, if you have our app, you can go in and you can at least try to sign up.
Right.
So do we want to do maybe one more?
Sure.
Maybe one of these.
How do you stop an anxiety attack?
Okay.
All right. So how do you stop an anxiety attack from happening when you know you will have to be exposed to your fears? Kind of like what Madina said earlier, right? The key word is, how do you stop an anxiety attack? So it's sort of the paradox of anxiety. And I feel like in life in general is the more you try to stop feelings, the stronger they feel. And so, trying to control human experiences is often like the root of the issue. And so, when you know that you're going to be exposed to your fears, reminding yourself, like, yes, like you might have an idea of how things might go, but you don't actually know how it'll go. And kind of seeing it as an opportunity to experience possibly some disconfirmation, definitely experience what it's like to experience anxiety, right? And see what actually happens when you have a sense of openness towards it. Because oftentimes our anticipatory anxiety is way worse than it actually is.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, basically that exact same phrase, right? A lot of times people will be like, Tina, it was not as not as bad as I thought. And I'm like, what? I'm shocked, right?
Right.
Anxiety has a great way of convincing you otherwise. And, the big thing I'll see here is, because you're so worried about having a panic attack, you created a circumstance in your body where it's more likely to have one, right? Oh my God, I'm sweating. Why am I sweating? And then maybe that makes your heart beat fast, right? Oh my God, now my heart's beating fast. I know I'm going to have a panic attack. And now you start shaking, right? And so again, it's that misinterpretation of those physical sensations that oftentimes can lead to more sensations.
Really, yeah. And then also, like if you are anxious, like that's okay, right? Like
Mhm.
anxiety is not the enemy. It's like the way that we treat anxiety and like the way that we respond to anxiety by kind of hiding away from it. That's really the thing that we want to change. And so, if you're afraid of things, whether it's, going to the grocery store or going out in public and shopping or talking in public or doing a live meeting, just practicing approaching it in like little steps, right?
Yeah.
And really kind of having that bring it on attitude towards it. Even when you're anxious, right? It's not a wait until I'm not anxious type of thing. It's even while
Mhm.
I'm going to do this thing.
Mhm.
Even if it means I just step outside of my house for 5 seconds and then I go back in, or I walk to my car and then I go back in, or I drive to my corner and then I go back in. Doing it even when you're anxious, bring your anxiety along with you.
Mhm.
That's not the enemy. So,
Mhm. Mhm.
right.
This is addicting, right?
Yeah, this is like so much more fun talking about being anxious before you are exposed to it. That was this was a live demonstration of that for me. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, we were both joking, right? This is a little bit of an ERP for us as well, because even though it felt scary, we still chose to get on here and answer some of your guys' questions.
Yeah.
And yeah, should we wrap up or?
Yeah, there's a lot more, but hopefully if we do this again, we can get around to the other ones if you come again. So,
Yeah. Yep.
yeah.
Well, thank you everyone for hanging out with us, asking such good questions.
Yeah. Nice to be able to talk about ERP and OCD.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.